We're TTB, the Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau.
Hello, this is TTB's Boot Camp for Wineries, the Basics, TTB and federal wine laws. This segment of the series will provide an overview of TTB, the functions we perform that are relevant to wineries, and the federal laws and regulations that apply to wineries. First, our disclaimer. This tells you that this presentation does not establish any new guidance today or set forth any new policy. My goal is to help you understand the laws and regulations administered by TTB. Also, the information that we're sharing today could at some point be superseded and become outdated. So always consult the most recent regulations for current requirements. Here's a look at what I will be covering in this session. First, I'll provide an overview of TTB to help familiarize you with TTB, how we're organized, and the functions that we perform, so that you feel comfortable coming to us if and when you have questions in the future. Then I'll provide a high-level overview of the three primary federal laws that are applicable to the wine industry and when they apply. So, who is TTB? We are a bureau within the Department of the Treasury. TTB formed in 2003 under the Homeland Security Act of 2002. It divided the functions of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms into two new entities. The Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives retained predominantly firearms and explosive-related functions within the Department of Justice, and TTB retained the tax collection, trade facilitation, and consumer protection functions within the U.S. Department of the Treasury. We currently have about 500 employees. Our headquarters are in Washington, D.C. We're right down the street from the main Treasury building and very close to the White House. Our Office of Permitting and Taxation is in Cincinnati, Ohio. We also have field districts located throughout the country, including Puerto Rico. And then these districts are where our auditors and investigators are. We also have 3 laboratories located in Maryland. So while our headquarters are in DC, we really are located throughout the country. As I noted, we are a bureau under the Department of the Treasury, and we are a tax revenue agency. So the first element in our mission is to collect the taxes. We have a long and storied history of collecting federal taxes on alcohol beverages. In fact, the first ones were collected in 1791. Those were implemented by Alexander Hamilton on distilled spirits to finance the Revolutionary War. And they have been an important source of revenue for the US government pretty much ever since. So while our bureau is only 21 years old, we continue to carry out a long history of taxing alcohol beverage products. In addition to tax collection, we also have functions to protect the public. We protect the consumer by ensuring the integrity of alcohol products. We want consumers to know what they are purchasing and to have the label adequately reflect what is inside the product. We also ensure that only qualified businesses enter the alcohol and tobacco industries. And we prevent the unfair and unlawful market activity for alcohol and tobacco products. We want to ensure a level playing field for those in the business. I'll describe the functions that we perform in support of our mission in just a bit as I describe the laws that we carry out. This is our organizational chart. It's not a comprehensive organizational chart, but it reflects the offices that you'll most often interact with. Our administrator is Mary Ryan, and our deputy administrator is Elizabeth Liz Can. They lead the agency. Under them, the offices that I want to tell you about today are the Office of Permitting Taxation, Headquarters Operations, and Field Operations. First, the Office of Permitting and Taxation. There are 2 important divisions there, application services and tax services. Together, these are known as the National Revenue Center. The National Revenue Center, as I mentioned, is located in Cincinnati, Ohio. The Application Services Division is responsible for issuing original permits and brewer's notices, and also processing permit amendments. The Tax Services Division is responsible for processing tax returns, operational reports, and claims for tax refunds. I should note the slides for this presentation are available on our website, ttb.gov, and we've included helpful links and citations throughout the slides. This green link will take you to the NRC, the National Revenue Center, web form where you can contact them. Under headquarters operations, we have our Alcohol Labeling and Formulation Division, the Scientific Services Division, our labs, and the Regulations and Rulings Division. That's the office that does our rulemaking and publishes guidance and other informational materials. Also, if you import or export wine or other alcohol beverage products, you'll likely interact with our International Affairs Division. Among their many duties, this is the office that manages our export certificate program. But the office that I really want to tell you about is ALFD, or the Alcohol Labeling and Formulation Division. You will likely interact with this office the most because they process applications for formulas and label approvals. In fact, in recent years, we received around 25,000 formula and 2,000 label applications annually. And the largest percent of our label applications are indeed wine applications. Next, under our Office of Field Operations, we have our Trade Investigations Division, as well as our Tax Audit Division and our Market Compliance Office. And I'll tell you a little bit about each of those offices. Investigators within our Trade Investigations Division are separated into 6 districts. The districts that you see here are color-coded with the map on the next slide. We've provided contact information for each field office. Investigators are a fantastic resource for you if you have questions and want to speak with someone locally who's likely familiar with your area. You can take a quick look here to see which district you are in. Again, local investigators are a great resource if you have questions, particularly on establishing or maintaining a compliant premises and also on maintaining compliant operations. You can see here that California is split into 2 districts. Southern California is in Western 1, and Northern California is in Western 2. Auditors within our tax audit division are also located throughout the country, but you'll likely only interact with them during an audit or if you see them at an outreach event. We'll be doing a presentation on what to expect during an audit, so definitely check that one out. Our Market Compliance Office. If you have a consumer complaint, a question about trade practices, or would like your marketing advertising material pre-cleared for compliance, this is the office that you'll contact. Note that they do have 2 separate email addresses, a general one and then one specific to trade practice questions, which I will briefly cover later in the presentation. Finally, I would like to tell you about our Office of Industry and State Outreach, or Office of Outreach for short. The focus of this office is to enhance our relationships with our regulated industry members, trade associations, and our state alcohol regulation counterparts. One of our primary goals is to promote voluntary compliance within the industry, and this office aims to provide industry members with the information and assistance they need to be compliant. Feel free to reach out anytime, either via web form or email. So now that you know about TTB and what we do, let's take a look at the typical touch points in which you can expect to interact with us. Your first touch point will be with our Office of Permitting Taxation that I mentioned. This will be when you apply for a bonded winery permit and or other permit types required by your business operations. And then also make sure to check out our boot camp module if you do want to know more about permits. Next, you will apply for formula approval if you need it. Note that you will do this prior to producing your product. Not all products require formulas. In fact, most wines likely do not require formula approval, but some wines do, and I'll touch more on that in a bit. Formula applications can be submitted through our online system, Formulas Online. We really work hard to keep processing times low for applications. They are often just a few days, and our customer service standard is 15 days. You can find these and all of our application processing times by searching for TTB application processing times in your favorite search engine. We'll cover formulas in a different boot camp module. The next thing that you'll do is the fun part, right? Produce your wine. As you're producing your wine, you want to make sure to keep sufficient and accurate records. If you aren't sure what records to keep or in what format or with what frequency, definitely check out the bootcamp module on records. Someone who knows records inside and out, a former investigator, will walk you through each of the types of records you'll need to keep and will give you some tips on avoiding common records violations. Next, you'll apply for label approval if you are selling wine with 7% or greater alcohol by volume in interstate commerce. Federal law requires all 7% or greater alcohol by volume wine offered for sale in interstate commerce to have a certificate of label approval. And we refer to those as COLAs for short. If you are producing wine 7% or greater alcohol by volume and not selling it in interstate commerce, you can instead apply for an exemption from label approval. All of the labeling requirements, along with tips for a compliant label application, will be presented in our bootcamp module on labeling. You can apply for COLAs and exemptions in our online system. Again, we are really working hard to keep processing times for these down. Our customer service standard is also 15 days for labels, and typically processing times are considerably less than that. Next, you will bottle and remove your products, again, keeping good records. Then you will file your tax returns, pay your taxes, and file operational reports. We'll be covering those activities in our bootcamp module on operational reports and tax returns. And then the last touch point is reporting changes after qualification. We refer to those as amendments, and it doesn't necessarily go here in the flow of things because amendments could be necessary at any time. Our module on permits will walk you through what triggering events would require you to file an amendment to your permits. Let's switch gears now. We'll touch on the primary federal laws and regulations that apply to wine production and related activities. There are really two primary laws that govern the regulations that we implement. This isn't a complete list, but it's a short one. First, we have the Internal Revenue Code, the IRC for short. And that is implemented in Part 24 of the Code of Federal Regulations. Then we have the Federal Alcohol Administration Act, or FAA Act, and that is implemented at 27 CFR Part 4. In case the distinction between a law and regulations isn't clear, the law is what Congress passes, and it's broader, more general than the regulations. It's essentially a framework for regulations. The federal agency with the authority granted by Congress to carry out that law then enacts regulations to implement the law. So the regulations are going to be a lot more comprehensive and a lot more detailed. Generally, to enact a regulation, the agency must go through a notice and comment rulemaking process. That is, the public has the opportunity to comment on the proposed regulation. Then the agency considers all of those comments before publishing a final rule. This is typically a lengthy process. So if you are ever interested in the timing of a proposed rule, keep in mind that it could be a considerable amount of time before it is enacted. And speaking of rulemaking, if you would like to stay informed on the rulemaking projects TTB is currently working on, you can find those, along with those of all other federal agencies, in the Unified Agenda, which is updated every spring and fall. You can find TTB and our rulemaking projects listed under the Department of Treasury. To find the Unified Agenda, just go to your favorite search engine and type in Unified Agenda, maybe include federal rulemaking, and you will find it. So again, you'll find the regulations implementing the IRC in 27 CFR Part 24, and for the FAA Act, 27 CFR Part 4. You will definitely want to get familiar with both of those sets of regulations. Additionally, we have the Alcohol Beverage Labeling Act, or ABLA for short, which is implemented at 27 CFR Part 16. That law is pretty easy and straightforward. It's the law requiring the health warning statement to appear on all alcohol beverage products labels containing 0.5% alcohol by volume or greater. As I briefly explain what each law and its implementing regulations contain, I'll emphasize the wine products that they apply to. The distinctions are really important in determining how your products are regulated, particularly for products that are classified as wine under our regulations, but which may you not necessarily consider wine, such as cider, mead, sake, and other lower alcohol wines and wine products. Also, as we'll discuss later, the food labeling provisions of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which is enforced by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, or FDA, those may apply to the labeling of some of these products instead of the FAA Act. So the Internal Revenue Code. I like to think of the IRC as the collect the revenue statute. It includes requirements for your qualification, record keeping, and reports and taxes. It also has formula requirements, again, only for some alcohol beverage products, and then minimum marks, brands, and labeling requirements. The FAA Act is where most of TTB's label requirements will come from. The IRC requirements essentially ensure that the product and its tax class are identifiable on the product. The IRC applies to all alcohol beverage products with at least 0.5% alcohol by volume, whether they are sold only within the state you are producing them in or they are being sold in interstate commerce. Let's take a look at what is considered to be a wine under the IRC. The IRC defines wine very broadly as every type of product produced on bonded wine premises from grapes, other fruit, including berries, or other suitable agricultural products containing not more than 24% alcohol by volume. So this definition includes cider and perry, which are other fruit, and mead, which is an agricultural product. The IRC definition of wine also includes imitation, other than standard, and artificial wines and compounds. However, wines with less than 0.5% alcohol by volume are not taxed as wine. So if you have a de-alcoholized wine that is less than 5%, it would still be considered a wine under the IRC regulations, but it's not taxable. The IRC establishes production standards for various types of wine. This list is not comprehensive, but the idea is to give you a visual sense of how the IRC classifies wine for production purposes. It breaks down wines into standard wine and then other than standard wine. Standard wines are further broken down into natural wine and special natural wine, which is a natural wine with natural flavor added. The reason this distinction is important is because natural wines do not require formula approval, but special natural wines do. If a wine doesn't fall within the category of standard wine, then under the IRC, it is by default an other than standard wine. Examples of these wines include wine made with sugar and or water beyond the limitations prescribed for standard wine, wine made by blending wines produced from different kinds of fruit, wines made with sugar other than pure dry sugar, liquid pure sugar, or invert sugar syrup, just to name a few. Generally, wines other than standard wine also require formula approval. Again, these classifications impact whether a formula is required, but they don't impact tax classification. Alcohol content and the level of carbon dioxide in the wine are the factors that impact tax classification for grape wine. For hard cider and perry, however, the ingredients used in production are also a factor in determining the applicable tax rate. Now, let's dig into the FAA Act a bit. While the IRC can be thought of as the collect the revenue statute, the FAA Act can be thought of as the protect the public statute. To protect consumers, the FAA Act includes provisions to ensure that only qualified businesses enter the market, ensure that labeling and advertising of alcohol beverages provide adequate information to the consumer about the identity and quality of the product, require that alcohol beverage bottlers and importers have an approved certificate of label approval, also known as a COLA, for wines sold or shipped in interstate commerce, and prevent misleading labeling or advertising that may result in consumer deception regarding the product. Congress also included provisions to prohibit anti-competitive practice that threaten the independence of retailers and or give industry members an unfair advantage over their competitors, which are referred to as trade practice provisions. The trade practice provisions cover exclusive outlet, tied house, commercial bribery, and consignment sales. Industry members who engage in these anti-competitive practices damage other law-abiding businesses. In case you aren't familiar with trade practices, we have a set of 5 videos covering the basics of what you should know about trade practices. If you search for TTB trade practices in your favorite search engine, you'll find our trade practices website where you can watch the videos. We also have an email box, tradepractices@ttb.gov, that I had mentioned earlier, that you can submit your inquiries to. So if you have a question on whether or not a certain activity is allowed, you can submit your email to the Trade Practices Program Manager, and they will do an assessment and let you know whether that's an allowable activity or not, or a potential violation. You'll see that I have noted in red that the FAA Act only applies to wines that are 7% to 24% alcohol by volume sold in interstate commerce. This is a distinction between the FAA Act and the IRC, so it's important to understand what wine is under the FAA Act and how those laws apply to your product. The FAA Act definition of wine refers to the IRC definition of wine and expands on that to include other alcohol beverages made in the manner of wine. The definition does have 2 caveats. It applies only to wine for non-industrial use, and here is the big difference. It applies only to wine that contains not less than 7% alcohol by volume. In other words, wine has to have 7% or more and up to 24% alcohol by volume to fall within the meaning of wine in the FAA Act. Additionally, it only applies to imported wines or wines offered for sale under interstate commerce. The definition does include agricultural wine, such as mead and cider, perry, vermouth, and sake. But again, only if the products are 7% or greater alcohol by volume and imported or offered for sale in interstate commerce. We recognize that this can be confusing and often challenging for wine producers, especially those that make wine products that are both more and less than 7% alcohol by volume. And we're always here to help if you have questions. The FAA Act regulations also establish standards of identity for the several classes and types of wine. These standards of identity are important because they dictate what the wine may be labeled and marketed as. There are 8 general classes of wine, and most of those classes are subdivided into more specific types of wine. For example, the class grape wine, that's a class, and then red wine and table wine are types defined within that class. Similarly, cider and perry are types within the class fruit wine. There are a number of factors such as the primary winemaking material, carbon dioxide content, maximum volatile acidity, and additional sugar content that affect which standard of identity a wine falls under, and therefore which class or type designation you may label it with. It is important to thoroughly review the standards of identity to ensure a wine is eligible to use the desired class or type designation. You may have noticed that there is not a class number 4 in this chart. There was formerly a class for citrus wine, but it was eliminated through rulemaking in 2020. Generally, citrus wines are now classified as fruit wines. So you may be wondering, what if a wine is under 7% alcohol by volume and or it is not in interstate commerce and therefore the FAA Act doesn't apply? Well, then the labeling and packaging provisions of the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which is under FDA's jurisdiction, will apply to your product instead of the FAA Act. That means there is no label pre-approval requirement and a different set of requirements for what must be on the label applies, including ingredient, nutrition, and allergen labeling. Finally, that brings us to our last relevant statute under TTB jurisdiction that I'll talk about, the Alcoholic Beverage Labeling Act. I mentioned this earlier as a straightforward statute. The purpose of the statute is to mandate the government health warning statement on all alcohol beverage products offered for sale or distribution in the United States, considering 0.5% alcohol by volume or greater. However, it is very specific about how the warning must appear. Failing to properly display the health warning statement on a wine label is one of the most common errors that we see on wine labels. So a great tip is to copy it from our website, where we have a web page dedicated to getting it right. You can find that along with all of our other wine labeling information by visiting our wine labeling pages at ttb.gov. So I just covered a lot of information about statutes and regulations, and thank you for sticking with me. Here's a recap of what applies and when. ABLA, that's the health warning statement. It applies to all wines with 0.5% or greater alcohol by volume offered for sale or distribution. It doesn't necessarily have to be for sale in the US. The IRC applies to all of those same wines. The FAA Act, however, applies to wines with 7% to 24% alcohol by volume in interstate commerce. And for wines less than 7% alcohol by volume, the FD&C Act applies. The relevant regulations are listed here, some of which I didn't cover today, but may be relevant to you and your wine business. Now that you've become familiar with the basics of TTB and the federal wine laws, here are a few suggestions to set you up for success. First, you will definitely want to become familiar with www.ttb.gov, which is our website. It has a ton of valuable resources and information on wine requirements and regulations. You will also want to become familiar with any other applicable federal and state rules for your operation. And then you also may want to check out our other TTB Bootcamp for Wineries videos on permitting, records, reports and returns, labeling, and formulas for foundational information on federal winery compliance. We also have modules on AVAs, what to expect in an audit, and what to expect in an investigation that has a ton of great compliance tips. With that, here are some resources that you might find helpful, either as you're getting started or want to keep up to date with all the latest information and educational content. So under Stay in Touch, we have a link to the Office of Outreach. As I mentioned before, we have a web form that you can use to submit feedback, questions, suggestions, anything that you would like us to know or are wondering about. You can also email us at outreach@ttb.gov. The next link is for our outreach program page, which is a great source of information to find where we'll be and when we'll be providing presentations, both in person and virtually. You can also find a web form to request TTB participation at an upcoming event. And then lastly, we have a link to subscribe to our newsletter. Our newsletter is a great way to stay up to date on all things TTB, including new regulations, including new or updated AVA and approved grape varieties, compliance tips, system updates, new videos or presentations, pretty much anything that you would need to know to stay updated. We encourage you to sign up if you haven't already. We also have very recently published fact sheets. The fact sheets will provide foundational information on each topic, as well as direct you to more information on our website. So we highly recommend that you check those out if you haven't already. I hope this information was helpful to better understand TTB and the work that we do. If you have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to us through the division-specific phone numbers, web forms, or email addresses that we provided throughout the presentation. Thank you so much for watching, and make sure to check out all of the other sessions in our Bootcamp for Wineries series available on ttb.gov.
Visit TTB's official YouTube channel at USTTB.gov for more TTB-related content. And remember to click subscribe so you'll always know when we upload new videos.